She stood before him, not as an enemy, not as a traitor, but as everything he ever wanted. Everything he had dreamed of through fire and blood. She was his anchor, his star, his reason. She could have ended the war before it began, not with weapons, but with a word. She could have taken his hand, not in submission, but in salvation. Not to rule with cruelty, but to rebuild with conviction. Two souls forged by loss and lit by passion, standing on the edge of history, and letting it fall away. The galaxy did not fall with the clash of sabers. It fell in the quiet, in the refusal to believe that power and love could coexist. It fell because no one saw the truth that burned behind Anakin's eyes, or the grief that trembled beneath Padme's voice. It fell because she could not see the boy inside the monster, and he could not hear the plea inside her silence. Power without purpose, love without trust, and fate without mercy. That was the Empire's beginning, and the Republic's end. Two hearts, both shattered by war, both reaching for a future only they could imagine. A future where peace was not earned through compromise, but carved through courage. A future where children could laugh without fear, where star systems could live without chains, and still, the chasm between them widened. Not because they stopped loving each other, but because they loved too carefully, too cautiously, too late. The galaxy held its breath, and when neither leaped, it broke apart like glass. We remember Padme as a symbol of peace, and Anakin as the sword that broke it. But what if that memory is a lie? What if they were never meant to oppose each other? What if their love was not weakness, but warning? What if the Chosen One was never meant to destroy the Sith alone, but to be made whole by the one person who believed in something more? What if her death was not inevitable, but a wound carved by fear? What if their tragedy was not destiny, but decision? In this video, we explore the choice Padme never made, the life Anakin never had, and the galaxy that might have risen instead of burned. We dive into the heartbreak, the possibilities, the fragile hope that flickered between them and died in silence. We unravel the layers of love and power, of devotion and destruction, of everything that was lost when they chose to stand on opposite sides of the fire, and we ask what might have been, if Padme had chosen him not in fear, but in faith. What if everything had turned out differently? What if her hand had reached for his, not in defiance, but in devotion? What if Padme had seen the rot in the Republic for what it was, and chosen to rebuild it by Anakin's side? What if love had been stronger than fear, stronger than duty, stronger than the rules of a dying order? What if instead of turning away, she stepped forward and changed everything? They were not just lovers, they were leaders. Two figures shaped by war, forged in loss, and driven by a desire to protect what they cherished. She saw the failures of politics, he saw the failures of the Jedi. Together they could have unmade them both. Not out of malice, but out of necessity. Not through conquest, but through rebirth. The Jedi had turned to dogma, the Senate to greed. Anakin wanted to cut through the corruption with the precision of a blade. Padme wanted to reform it with the compassion of a heart. If they had joined forces, they might have balanced each other. His fury with her grace, his chaos with her clarity. Their child would have grown under their reign, not as a pawn of destiny, but as a symbol of unity. Not as a secret hidden away, but as a future raised in truth and purpose. A new generation of Skywalkers guiding a new kind of galaxy. Not Jedi, not Sith. Something wholly new. Something built on choice. And yet, history turned on a silence, on a hesitation, on a look not returned, a plea not answered, on a love that could not leap far enough to escape gravity. The moment passed. The galaxy held its breath. And then, it fell. Why did she stop at the edge of his pain? Why didn't she see how much he was drowning in shadows he couldn't name? Why didn't she understand that he didn't want power for himself? He wanted control because everything else was slipping through his fingers. The Jedi, the war, the nightmares, her. She loved him, but loved ideals more. She believed in democracy while watching it collapse beneath her feet. She believed in peace while fire spread across star systems. She believed in hope while Anakin believed in action. She hoped too long. He acted too fast. Padme had fought her entire life against apathy. She stood alone on countless floors of empty halls. She saw senators trade lives for credits. She watched votes go to war like currency tossed on a table. She knew the system was broken, and still, she tried to fix it with words while Anakin reached for power. There is something devastating about what could have been if hearts had turned half a step. About watching two people meant to save the world instead become its eulogy. There is a grief in knowing they loved each other enough to break, but not enough to bend. Padme's last breath was not taken, it was given. She died not from wounds, but from what she could not bear. She saw the man she loved become the monster she feared. Not because he wanted to, but because he thought it was the only way. Anakin was never the villain, he was the cost. The toll exacted by a galaxy that chews up good men and spits out monsters. He became what he hated, because no one else could stop what he feared. He became Vader because she walked away, and he had nothing left to protect. Their tragedy was not written in fate, it was written in hesitation, in moments they could not share, in truths they could not say aloud, in the silence between breaths, in the space between stars, in a tear that never fell. They were the dream, they were the fire, and then they were the ruin. Not because they failed each other, but because they believed the other wouldn't understand. And that belief, that quiet fracture, broke the galaxy in half. Imagine a different path. One where Padme stands before the Jedi Temple, not in fear, but in command. One where Anakin's march is not a massacre, but a cleansing of rot. A storm, not of death, but of justice. A fire that burns the dead wood and leaves behind the seeds of something better. Imagine Padme by his side in the Senate, not pleading, but proclaiming. A voice for the people louder than Palpatine's whispers. A queen once more. But this time crowned by the will of a galaxy ready for rebirth. Not a puppet, not a senator, a sovereign of a new age. Picture them together in the halls of power, hand in hand, not in secrecy, not in shame, but as rulers, architects of a future they both ached to believe in. Imagine her calming his storms, and him guarding her heart. Picture the Empire never rising. Picture the Jedi reforming instead of falling. Picture planets united not by fear, but by choice. Picture a galaxy where the Skywalkers are not legend or warning, but foundation, family, future. It is not impossible to dream of it. It only takes one change. One breath, one touch, one whisper that said yes instead of no. And in that tiny shift, the galaxy could have been saved. Maybe their love still matters. Maybe the ashes still carry seeds. Maybe the story of Padme and Anakin is not just tragedy, but lesson. Maybe it teaches that unity does not mean surrender, that love does not mean weakness, that power does not have to mean control. Perhaps in another time, another story. Their children finished what they could not begin. Luke brought light back to the darkness. Leia led armies with grace and iron. Together, they became what Anakin and Padme could have been, but never were allowed to be. And maybe that is why their story endures, because it holds the shape of something we all ache for. A love not broken by fear, a power not corrupted by pain, a future not stolen by silence. There is still time, in every generation, in every world. There are voices that rise to choose differently, to speak when silence is easier, to reach when pulling away feels safer, to fight for what could be, instead of mourning what was lost. And so the question lives on, not in regret, but in resolve. What would you have chosen? What will you choose? When love stands before you in flames, will you run, or will you rise? Padme should have joined Anakin, not because he was right, but because he was hers. Not because his path was pure, but because love could have changed its course. Not because power is the answer, but because she might have been. Love is not safe. It is not soft. It is not gentle when it collides with destiny. It breaks, it burns, it reshapes everything it touches. And in their story, it failed not because it was weak, but because it stood alone. Anakin was never meant to rise by himself. Padme was never meant to stand against him. Together, they were balance. Apart, they were imbalance made flesh. One fueled by fire, the other by hope. But fire consumes hope when it is left alone. Their fall was not inevitable. It was preventable. And that is the sorrow that lingers. Not that they died, but that they could have lived. Not that they loved, but that they didn't leap. And so we remember them not as rulers, not as saviors, but as a warning carved into stars. That even the greatest love, if left unspoken, can let the galaxy burn.